It's a question that's asked by people of all ages, from every walk of life. The 75-year-old man who leaves his longtime home and begins a life in a nursing home sits and wonders the question, who's going to love me? Who's going to love me now? The 45-year-old woman who watched her husband die a slow death to cancer. Now she's alone in her bedroom and she can't sleep. All she can do is stare and wonder, who's going to love me? Who's going to love me? Every teenager, whether they admit it or not, wonders the same thing. Will I be accepted? Will I be asked to the prom? And it all comes back to the same question, who's going to love me? Say it with me. Who's going to love me? Turn to John chapter 10. Jesus knew better than anyone else, as well he should. He created us in his image. He knows to this day that what we long for most in this world, in every one of our lives, is for someone to truly love us. To truly love us. In John chapter 10, the setting of this scripture comes right on the heels of a man who was born blind, and Jesus enables him to see. He heals him. In the midst of that, his integrity, the integrity of the man who was healed, is questioned by the religious leaders. They begin to try to poke holes into his story and discount the miracle that Jesus just performed. Finally, they had enough of this guy and they throw him out. And in John chapter 10, Jesus launches into a discourse that shows the contrast between those who love people and those who love power. There's a big difference. To get his point across, he uses an analogy that everyone in that culture would have understood and grabbed a hold of. He uses the analogy of a shepherd and a sheep. Why would he do that? Why would he use a shepherd and a sheep? Well, everyone back then knew what a shepherd was and knew what sheep were. In that image, in the Jewish people's mind, a shepherd was any leader, whether spiritual or political. If they thought of a shepherd, they could think of the king, they could think of a prophet, whether in the government or spiritually, they were shepherds. They were leading people. So all of them could relate to this analogy. And in John 10, Jesus begins to talk about the difference between someone who loves his sheep and the thief that steals the sheep. John chapter 10, beginning in verse 1, this is what Jesus says. I tell you the truth. The man who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber. The man who enters by the gate is the shepherd of his sheep. The watchman opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. So who's going to love me? Well, the great shepherd is someone who knows me. Someone who knows me. Now, why is that so important? Well, this shepherd had more than just a herding kind of relationship with this sheep. He knew this sheep. He was intimate with his flock. And he knew them so well that he loved all over them. He had a real relationship with them. If you're a good shepherd, you do. You might say, well, how did he know which sheep was his? Well, a couple of ways. First, every sheep had a distinctive earmark that was put there in his ear by the shepherd. So he could tell, even if his sheep was a little ways away, by looking at the ear, he could see the earmark. Thus he knew that sheep belongs to my flock. He's or sheep is in my care. A second way is the sheep responded to the shepherd's voice, to their master's voice. Look at verse 3 and 4, continuing in John 10. Let's read this together. He calls his own sheep read that last line. They know him because of what? They know his voice. Every morning the sheep pen would be filled with sheep from different flocks. And if the shepherd, all the shepherd had to do was speak, and his sheep would begin to follow him. In that day, a shepherd would speak in the form, they would kind of make a sound, like a yodeling sound. I asked Dan to yodel, but he said, no, I can't yodel. Not going there. I'll hold the sheep. I'm not yodeling. All right? But they would yodel. A distinct noise that the sheep would listen and follow the shepherd's call. Let's give these guys a hand. Now, to this day, when my mom calls me on the phone, my parents live about 8-9 hours away in Northeast Ohio. When she calls me on the phone, every single time, I'll answer the phone and she'll say this. She'll say, Jeff, hello, it's your mom. She actually says it. She doesn't have to say it. I said, Mom, I know it's you. Every single time. It tells me on my phone, Mom, and I know your voice. When I was young, and still to this day, but when I was young and when I was growing up, kids had more freedom. You could just run and go crazy wherever you wanted to go. So if I was even 3 blocks away, or as a teenager, if I was in a gymnasium full of thousands of people, my dad had a distinct call. He was able to, something I can't do. That's it. That's my whistle. All right? My dad, though, took 2 fingers and he would put them in his mouth, as some of you can do. Anybody in here can do it? Can you do it? Do it. All right, that's weak. It was louder than that. Good job, though. Good job. Good illustration. Even if I was 2-3 blocks away, I'd hear that. Number one, I knew I was in trouble. I'd better hightail it and make that little banana seat bike go as fast as it can go to get home. Now, why did that affect me that way? When my mom calls, I know her voice. When my dad whistles, I know my dad's whistle. Because I have a relationship with them that has grown over time. That's, in a sense, what I'm talking about when the shepherd knows when the sheep knows its master's voice. But the intimacy we have with our shepherd, the Lord, goes so much deeper than that. He knows everything about you. The psalmist writes in Psalm 139, He knit you together in your mother's womb. Matthew 10, Jesus reminds us that that God the Father knows even the number of hairs that are on your head. He knows everything about you. Now, there's a difference when the dishonest shepherd would go and try to get the sheep to follow him. The sheep wouldn't follow. They didn't know his voice. They didn't know anything about him, so they didn't move. Thus, the thief could not steal the sheep. And a thief would never try to lead the sheep away. They would always steal the sheep. For a good shepherd knows this one thing. This one thing, you never drive sheep, you lead sheep. And there's a big difference. And you can lead them because that shepherd knows his sheep. He knows them inside and out and wants to get to know them more. He knows when they are healthy. He knows when they are sick. He knows when the sheep are strong just by looking at him. And he knows when the sheep are weak. And the good news for you and me is our good shepherd knows us even more than that. And you, as you're here today, can rest assured. Who's going to love you? Someone that knows you better than you know yourself. The Good Shepherd. God. Father, we thank you that you know us, yes, God, even better than we know our own selves. God, we thank you for being intimate with us. God, getting to know us, doing life with us, God, every single moment of every day with your Spirit. God, thank you that you care that much. God, that you know every single person in this room's name. And you know the depths of their heart all the way to their soul. God, may we find comfort in that.
I have a maker. He formed my heart before even time began. My life was in his hand. He knows my name. He knows my every thought. He sees each tear that falls, and he hears me when I call. I have a Father. He calls me his own. He'll never leave me, no matter where I go. 'Cause he knows my name, and he knows my every thought, and he sees each tear that falls, and he hears me when I call. Yes, he hears me when I call.
Not only does the Good Shepherd know us, but he also protects us. Sheep are about the only animal with no defense mechanism. They can't run fast because their knees won't bend. Anybody else feel like, no, that's you? That's me, all right? They have no way to harm a predator. They have no, ever hear a sheep growl? No, sheep don't growl. They have no fierce growl. They have no defense mechanism. All they can do is rub up against you and make you itch. That's it. They have no protection mechanism, but they don't need any because they have a what? A shepherd who protects them, grows with them. John chapter 10, verses 12 and 13. Jesus says this. Let's read this out loud. The hired hand You get that? Why would the hired hand run away when the wolf showed up? Because he doesn't care about the sheep. He doesn't have a relationship with the sheep. He doesn't even know the sheep. Why would he risk his life for the sheep? Where the shepherd will not only not run away from danger, but the shepherd will run straight into the threat to protect his sheep. Every single time. The concept of the divine shepherd goes back to Psalm 23, centuries before Christ. The psalmist wrote from the perspective of the sheep and said, "The Lord is my shepherd. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." And that comfort came because the sheep knew they were protected. They're protected in other ways by the shepherd as well. You might not know it, but sheep are pestered by something called a nosefly. A nosefly. What the nosefly will do is the nosefly will land on a sheep's nose, enter in, and be a part of the soft membrane of the sheep's nose. When he gets in there, that fly lays its eggs. Eventually, the eggs what? Hatch. And it drives the sheep nuts. Imagine if you had eggs hatch in your nose. And the shepherd knows it. The sheep going crazy. The shepherd knows it. So what does the shepherd do? Well, the shepherd takes a special oil and puts it on the sheep's nose. It repels the flies, kills the flies, and the sheep is all right. Thus, King David said, "You anoint my head with oil." The protection that our good shepherd gives us. Ezekiel 34:12 and 16a says this: "The shepherd looks after his scattered flock when he is with them. So will I look after my sheep. I will rescue them from the places where they were scattered on the day of clouds and darkness. I will search for the lost and bring back the strays. I will bind up the injured and strengthen the weak." Hear that? How does he protect us? How does God protect you? One way is spiritually. You and I will never know how many fiery darts God has blocked that Satan has shot our way. We're not going to know that, but he protects us from that. 2 Thessalonians 3:3, Paul tells us, "But the Lord is faithful. He will strengthen and protect you from the evil one." The good shepherd will sometimes protect us physically. None of us know things that we've been prevented in our life from happening to us. A car accident. Have you ever driven down the road and you got upon a car accident, and if you were only 5 minutes earlier, it would have been you? That's not a coincidence. That's a God thing. Story has been told of a priest named Felix of Nola who lived around 250 AD, during the time where Christians were under intense persecution. He was fleeing for his life, and he was being pursued over hill and valley with no place to hide to find safety. Story says he fell exhausted in a wayside cave, expecting his enemies to come by any moment and take his life and kill him. Upon entering the cave, waiting for his own death, he saw a spider in the entrance of the cave weaving a web. And he watched the spider until the spider created a beautifully, beautifully woven web that covered the entire entrance of the cave. When the pursuers arrived, they wondered if Felix of Nola might be inside that cave. But upon seeing the beautiful masterpiece that the spider had created, they thought and shared, there's no way he can be in there. He would have disturbed the web upon entry. And so they went on. After his escape, Felix of Nola explained it this way. This is what he said. Where God is, a spider's web is like a wall. Where God is not, a wall is like a web. Read it with me. Where God is, whoa. You say, okay, Jeff, what about the time I needed him to be a good shepherd and protect me, and he didn't show up? What about that, Jeff? What about when I was going through the divorce, Jeff? Where was God? Where was this good shepherd of protection that you tell me I have? Jeff, when I was in that car wreck, when I was struggling so bad with my finances, where was the good shepherd, Jeff? Someone else will say, when I watched my spouse suffer and die of cancer, where was the good shepherd to protect my spouse and me? Listen to this close. Jesus never promised protection from storms. He only promised protection in the storms. He never promised protection from the storms. He only promised protection in the storm. Who's going to love me? Someone that protects me. A good shepherd that knows me. And then finally and ultimately, someone who's willing to give his life for me. That's the ultimate proof. Someone who's willing to lay down his life for me. John 10:11, Jesus says this. Read it with me. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. Read it again. Notice he doesn't say, I am a good shepherd. He says, I am the good shepherd. He goes on in John 10:17 and 18. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down on my own accord. I have authority to lay it down. I have authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father. Now I want you to remember something about the setting of all this. For centuries, the blood of an innocent sheep or lamb had to be sacrificed to atone for sins. But all that changed when Jesus showed up here. All of it changed. See, in the Old Testament, it was always the sheep or the lamb that had to die. But in the New Testament, it switches, and now the shepherd must die for the sheep. For you and me. How do you know somebody loves you? How do you know God loves you? Because he suffered and died on a cross in your place. The shepherd allowed his son to die for you. That's how much he loves you.
Isaiah chapter 52 and 53. See, my servant will act wisely. He will be raised and lifted up and highly exalted. Just as there were many who were appalled at him, his appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any man, and his form marred beyond human likeness. So he will sprinkle many nations, and kings will shut their mouths because of him. For what they were not told, they will see, and for what they have not heard, they will understand.
Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before us like a tender shoot, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain, like one from whom people hide their faces. He was despised, and we held him in low esteem.
Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all.
He was oppressed and afflicted, yet did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shears is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away, yet who of his generation protested? For he was cut off from the land of the living, and by the transgression of my people he was punished. He was assigned a grave with the wicked, and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth.
Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Therefore I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death, and was numbered with the transgressors. For he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. Isaiah 52 and 53.
I want you to come back with me. Come back with me to the first century, when the Christians were under such intense persecution that they scattered. Being a proselyte of the Jewish faith myself, I made my way back to my hometown of Cyrene. I spent the evening at a friend's house, but I got up at the crack of dawn. I made my way to the crest of the hill, which overlooked the city that we all so dearly loved, Jerusalem. And upon looking on the city, I expected to see crowds of people going into the city gate, entering into the city. But to my surprise, on this day, there were crowds of people coming out of the city gate and leaving the city. My curiosity overcame me, so I grabbed a small man and I pulled him by the arm. And I said, "Hey, what's going on today?" He said, "Oh, haven't you heard? There's going to be an execution. 3 men are going to die today." And he laughed a hideous laugh and he ran away. Well, I'd never seen an execution before. And being a big man, I elbowed my way to the front of the crowd. I tell you, I got so close, I could have reached out and touched any of the 3 men as they went by. And as I looked at them, the first 2 men, I could tell they were criminals and they deserved the kind of death they were about to receive. But that third man was a fine figure of a man. But wow, he looked as though he had endured amazing persecution the night before. In the midst of that bloody mess, he looked more like an animal than a human. As I looked at him, I could see compassion in his eyes. But his body, his back had been lacerated. His skin was dangling off. And all over his body, you could see the blood pumping from the beating of the night before. I looked, I said, how can he even be alive? How can he even be alive? I watched as Jesus picked up the cross. At that point, though, I really didn't realize he was Jesus, to be honest with you. He picked up the cross and he started to carry the cross, and under the heavy weight of that cross, he fell to the ground. He fell to the ground and he realized he couldn't go any further, but as he laid on the ground, his legs continued to kick. It was as if he had a special purpose for his life. Just then, one of the Roman soldiers pulled a sword and he pointed to me and he said, you carry that cross. I thought, surely he doesn't mean me. Surely not me. And another Roman guard took with his massive hand and shoved me to the ground and said, yes, you carry his cross. With cursing on my lips, I picked up the cross and I started to make my way up the hillside. When I got to the top of the hill, I gave the cross over to the man. And I faded back into the crowd. And I watched as the execution took place. They took steel spikes. They drove the steel spikes into his hands. They drove the steel spike into his feet. And then they lifted up the cross and they dropped it in the ground. And the thud of that cross hitting the ground echoed through the mountains and the valleys around us. And there he hung, as though he were suspended between heaven and earth. And then the crowd started to taunt. The angry mob started to scream, "Hail King Jesus! Hail King Jesus! Hail King Jesus!" And that name, at that moment, it jarred my thinking. Is this that Jesus? Is this the miracle-working Jesus? Is this the Jesus that I've heard so much about, that made the blind see, the lame walk, and the dead to come to life? Is this Jesus from Galilee? Is this him? And then the crowd continued. You saved others, why don't you save yourself? Christ, if you're the Christ, come down from that cross, save yourself. And I'm saying, yes, Jesus, you saved others, save yourself, come down from the cross, come down. And then they continued to scream all the more. Speak to us. Speak to us, King Jesus, they said. Speak to us. And I'm thinking, I said, yes, Jesus, speak. Say something on your behalf, Jesus. Speak. Call down fire from heaven. Allow that fire to destroy these enemies. Speak, Jesus, say something. And they start screaming, "Hail, King Jesus. Speak to us, King Jesus. Speak to us." And if I live to be 1,000 years old, I will never forget the words that fell from his lips as he hung on the cross. Jesus simply said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." I made my way to the bottom of the hill, with tears running down my cheeks. I thought, that cross that I thought would be my greatest shame, to this day is still my greatest glory. Yes, Jesus loves me. Jesus loves me.